Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the worn recipe box. The cardboard was soft at the corners. The lid had a coffee stain that looked like a butterfly. Inside, written in her grandmother's looping handwriting on a yellowed index card, was the gingerbread recipe she'd been afraid to try for 5 years. The kitchen filled with golden afternoon light as she lined up the ingredients. Molasses, dark and thick like honey from some ancient hive. Ginger that tickled her nose when she opened the jar. Cinnamon that reminded her of Sunday mornings. Cloves that made her think of Christmas stockings and pine trees. "Always warm the molasses first," she whispered, hearing her grandmother's voice in her head. "That's the secret to soft cookies." The spoon clinked against the measuring cup, and for a moment, Sarah was 8 years old again, standing on a wooden stool in her grandmother's kitchen, waiting for her turn to stir. The dough came together just as she remembered, sticky at first, then smooth and firm under her palms as she rolled it out. The familiar scent wrapped around her like one of her grandmother's hugs, warm and safe and full of love. Tears pricked at her corners of her eyes, but she smiled as she cut out the first gingerbread person. Maybe some memories weren't meant to stay locked away in recipe boxes. Maybe they were meant to be kneaded into dough and baked into something new. The kitchen timer chimed, a gentle reminder that echoed through the quiet house. Sarah opened the oven door, and another wave of spicy sweet memories washed over her. The cookies were perfect, golden brown with slightly darker edges, just like Grandma's. As she lifted them carefully onto the cooling rack, she remembered how her grandmother would always make 2 batches. One for decorating, and one for eating warm, straight from the oven. "Life's too short to wait for icing," she'd say with a wink. Sarah picked up the smallest cookie, still warm enough to make her fingertips tingle. The first bite melted on her tongue, and suddenly she was sitting at her grandmother's kitchen table, snow falling outside the window, while Christmas carols played softly on the old radio. She hadn't expected it to hurt this much, this simple act of baking cookies. But with each bite, each breath of ginger-scented air, the grief felt different. Softer somehow. Like the edges had been smoothed away by time and sugar and love. When the cookies were cool enough, Sarah mixed the icing, powdered sugar, milk, and a drop of vanilla, just like the recipe card said. As she piped smiles onto each gingerbread face, she realized she was smiling too. For the first time since the funeral, thinking about her grandmother felt more like warmth than pain. Sarah arranged the finished cookies on her grandmother's old blue plate, the one with the chip on the edge that they'd always saved for special occasions. Each gingerbread person seemed to smile back at her with their wobbly icing grins, none of them perfect, all of them perfect enough. She poured herself a cup of tea in one of the delicate cups from her grandmother's china set, the ones she'd inherited but had been too afraid to use until now. The steam rose in lazy spirals as she sat at her kitchen table, just as the sun was beginning to set. Taking out her phone, Sarah snapped a picture of the cookies and sent it to her mother with a message, "Grandma's recipe. Come over? Bring milk." 10 minutes later, her phone buzzed with a reply, "On my way. Dad too. He says to save him the burnt ones, you know how he always loved those best." Sarah laughed. A real laugh that surprised her with its warmth. Maybe that's what her grandmother had known all along. That recipes weren't just instructions for making food, they were instructions for making memories, for keeping love alive, for healing hearts. One batch of cookies at a time. She picked up another cookie and took a bite, letting the flavors of childhood, of love, of memory flood through her. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, and somewhere, she was sure, her grandmother was smiling.